All right, here we go. So our prompt is about the extent to which the French and Indian War caused the development of a distinct American identity. So there's two things going on here. There's the French and Indian War, and there's the idea of a distinct American identity. So when I look at the causes here, I think about, okay, both of those ideas, the French and Indian War and the distinct American identity. So this first cause here is European conflicts kind of led to the French and Indian War. Things like the Anglo-Spanish conflict over trade. There were some rivalries between Spain and France and England that were, have been going on for a long time. I did have King George's War here, but then I remember that was actually in the colonies, so that's why I crossed that out. So there aren't like big specific examples of this, but it is important to remember that France and England were rivals. France was a Catholic country, England was a Protestant country, so they're rivals to each other. I could have put here, I guess, another bullet point, Protestant versus Catholic rivalry. Our second category is also about the French and Indian War, but this brings it into the colonies. And this is the conflict in the Ohio River Valley. That's the area that's kind of west of the Appalachian Mountains, kind of by like where Ohio is today, and that kind of area. And the French are expanding down from Canada into that area due to the fur trade. They have their traders and some Jesuit missionaries going in there. Remember, the French didn't have big settlements, but they did have kind of trappers and stuff that would go into the interior of North America to trap fur. The British also were expanding to that area too, and they built Fort Necessity, which was led by George Washington. And then this was actually not too far from a French fort, Fort Duquesne. And this kind of brought tension because you have two military forts very close to each other. And there's actually going to be a battle at Fort Necessity, which the British lose badly and George Washington loses badly, which is going to kind of kick off the French and Indian War. Our final category is about the relationships between the colonies. This deals more with the American identity aspect of it. So you have the independent colonial governments that they didn't have a lot of interference from Britain, where Britain was kind of just leaving them alone to kind of do what they want. Even though you have the Navigation Acts, the enforcement's kind of tough, so there's lots of smuggling going on. The colonies were kind of left to fend for themselves. Britain is very far away across the Atlantic Ocean, so there's not a whole lot of interference there. But at the same time, you do have regional differences too. New England and the Chesapeake are very different places, different labor systems, different social classes, different religions, different groups of people, right? And there was a lot of maybe not tension, but a lot of kind of differences in how they operated. And then the failure of the Albany Plan of Union. This was a plan in which the different colonies would kind of unite together to protect themselves from conflict with the natives, but it ultimately failed because colonies weren't able to or willing to give up some of their independent powers to tax and stuff. But you also have trading between the colonies. You have roads that are connecting colonies, postal service between the colonies. So all those things develop these relationships. In some ways, their colonies are kind of bring kind of more together, like in terms of the trade and roads and stuff, as well as the independent colonial government. In some ways, they're separate in the regional differences with different economies, different types of people, and the failure of the Albany Plan and wanting to remain independent. Okay, so those are our causes. Now, if we look at the effects here, like how did the French and Indian War impact the distinct American identity? So our first effect here is like the attitudes of the colonists and British that came out of the French and Indian War. So the colonists resented the fact that the British impressed soldiers. Impressment is basically when the British government forces you to, they basically sort of kidnap you and force you to join and serve in the army. Colonists did not like that. Also, during the war itself, the British soldiers acted kind of arrogantly towards the colonists. They felt like the British soldiers acted like they were better than the colonists, and the colonists were kind of uncivilized or not as good. So that was kind of made the relationship between the colonists and British a little more tense. And also there was some bitterness on the part of the British because they didn't feel like the colonists helped enough during the war. Your book talks about how some colonist farmers would sell to the French and to the French allies, some of the Indian tribes that were the allies of the French. And they felt like that was not great. That was not very helpful. And they didn't feel like the colonists were kind of tried hard enough to do their part in the war. So these attitudes existed on both sides. the colonists didn't like the British didn't like the colonists. So it was kind of separating them out a little bit. Second category are the changes in British government. So after the French and Indian War, you have this large war debt that Britain has to pay off. They're not able to pay because they had to borrow a lot of money to pay for this war because it was a war that was in the Americas, the French and Indian War, and at the same time in Europe called the 7 Years' War. He also had a new king, George III, who was kind of like unstable and not predictable. So that kind of made things a little bit more difficult as well. And so the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was a way to kind of cut costs for the British government, so they didn't have to send soldiers to protect the colonists that were moving into the Ohio River Valley, which I mentioned back here. And also, if you have a large war debt, not only do you have to cut costs, but you also have to raise revenue. So the British government had more direct control of the colonies, more taxes, right? We see this with the Stamp Act. They are stationing military in the colonies as well. And you have laws like the Currency Act to try and limit the amount of gold and silver in the colonies. So all of these things, all these changes in the relationship between the British government and the colonies in terms of government make a difference. And they kind of create some resentment between the colonists and the British. Finally, you start to have organized colonial resistance to some of these actions. Some of these resistance takes place early on, and it's not in relation to British actions, but actually colonial taxes. So the Paxton Boys and the Regulator movement, these are actually colonists that don't like taxes imposed by the colonial governments, not the British government. But it does kind of set a pattern of colonists kind of getting together to resist things they don't like. And then this moves into resistance to British acts. Okay, so there are groups that form like the Sons of Liberty. They'll become famous for things like the Boston Tea Party later on. You have boycotts as a result of the Stamp Act. And then you actually have the Virginia government, the House of Burgesses, issues the Virginia Resolve. So it's basically kind of brings about the idea of no taxation without representation. The Virginia Resolves tell the British government like that only people that are actually having to pay the tax get to have a say in the tax. So these are all kind of organized colonial resistance to some of the British actions. Okay, so our effects here, we have the attitudes of the British colonists and towards the British and vice versa. We have the changes in the British government, and we start to see organized colonial resistance. Okay, all of these things you have to weigh out to decide which matters the most in terms of developing a distinct American identity. Which of these three would be the most if you're writing a thesis statement? Okay, well, good luck on that.